Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for sticking around. I might be mistaken, but I thought that the sweet tea offering was after the Dharma talk, so I really appreciate you hanging around for the talk. But I wanted to thank, of course, Lisa Shimamoto and Bombu Taiko and Yamaoka Flowers for basically helping us, celebrate the birth of the Buddha. And also thank all of you for attending today. So, I used to be the staff minister here, so I'm very familiar with all the work that goes into the Hanamatsuri service as a very special service. So I also want to thank Reverend Nagamini. I think she's ill today, so I don't know. I'm sure she had something to do with it. Oh, see that, Senshi? She is feeling a little under the weather. But speaking of the Buddha's birth, so I think we all know he was born as Prince Siddhartha in Lumbini Garden, and the stories tell us that upon his birth, flowers and sweet rain fell from the sky, and then, of course, later at the age of 35, Siddhartha would go on to attain awakening and become the Buddha. And so, I think it's really significant that 2,500 years later, the auspicious birth of the baby that went on to become the Buddha, the awakened one, is recreated by the beautiful Hanamido and by our flower offerings and our pouring of sweet tea today. So there's a famous story about the Buddha and the early Sangha that formed around him not long after he attained awakening. And actually, I was working on this talk and I was, putting it together, and then I had this senior moment where I thought, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. Have I given this talk before? And yes, I have. I think, I'm not sure, maybe several years ago, I gave this talk or something like this talk. But if you don't mind, I'd like to still share it again, because I think there's a certain aspect of its significance that I'd like to highlight for you today. So, thank you for your understanding. So I think we know, the Buddha's birth mother was Queen Maya, but sadly, when Prince Siddhartha was only a week old, she mysteriously died. And then the woman who was then called upon to take over the care and nurturing of the baby Buddha was Queen Maya's younger sister, whose name was Prajapati, or as she's respectfully known by Buddhists, Mahaprajapati, or Great Prajapati. Now, some scholars sort of interpret this that she may have been at least somewhat reluctant at the time, because taking over the role of the queen and also mother to the baby Buddha meant giving up her life in service to Queen Maya's husband, King Suddhodana, and to the young prince. But then fast forwarding to the time of this story, Siddhartha had now attained enlightenment, and he'd become the Buddha, and he'd returned to his home in Kapilavastu, and he'd begun sharing his awakening. He'd begun sharing the Dharma with his family. And it's said that Mahaprajapati was deeply moved by hearing his teachings. So moved, in fact, that upon hearing the teachings of her son, the Buddha, Mahaprajapati attained the stage in early Buddhism known as Sotapanna, or stream entry. So this term, Sotapanna, or stream entry, is a very interesting term because it refers to someone who enters or becomes one with the Buddha's core teaching of the impermanence of all things, and which the Buddha often likened to a constantly flowing stream. Sotapanna, or stream entry, is the first and arguably the most important step in one's path as a Buddhist. Why? Because it means one is firmly established on the path towards awakening and has no doubt about the truth of the Buddha's teaching. I think you can see why it's a very significant step in one's path. So years later, when her husband, King Suddhodana, died, the story says that 500 of the Buddha's male lay followers decided to take ordination and join the monastic Sangha. Perhaps not surprisingly, because of her having entered the stream, Mahaprajapati approached the Buddha and told him that she also wanted to enter the Sangha and ordain. So in other words, she wanted to become the first Buddhist nun. But the Buddha denied her wish. At this time, 2,500 years ago in ancient India, the Sangha was only open to men. But it's said that she then made the same request 2 additional times, only to receive the same negative response from the Buddha, and she's said to have been in tears. Then the Buddha, he had a talk to give, so he left Kapilavastu for a retreat in the distant town of Vaishali. But what's really remarkable is that although she was disappointed by the Buddha's refusal to admit her, Mahaprajapati then made a bold decision. Actually, it wasn't just Mahaprajapati, it was also the wives of those 500 men. All of these women decided that they too wanted to receive ordination and enter the monastic Sangha and seek full enlightenment. See, they'd all been listening to the Buddha's sermons, and their own desire to seek awakening, their sotapanna, was also established. And so despite the Buddha's refusal, Mahaprajapati and her 500 followers shaved their heads, donned the saffron-colored robes of monks, and followed the Buddha to Vaishali. They made the 200-mile trip to Vaishali on foot, and it's said that when they arrived at Vaishali, where the Buddha was teaching, they were all covered in dust and had swollen feet. The trip had been very difficult. Seeing Mahaprajapati and her 500 followers arrive in distress, Ananda, who I think you know is the Buddha's cousin and his close disciple, saw her and asked, "Why are you crying?" Mahaprajapati explained that the Buddha had refused her request to enter the Sangha, and then Ananda, who was moved by the obvious dedication of Mahaprajapati and her followers, is said to have decided to intercede on her behalf and then speak to the Buddha personally. He went to the Buddha and told him that Mahaprajapati, the very woman who had raised him, was outside crying with swollen feet and covered in dust. "She is crying," Ananda explained, "because you, the Buddha, have refused to allow women to enter the Sangha. It would be good if women were given permission to do this." But the Buddha's reply was the same as it had been before. But then, just as Mahaprajapati herself had done, Ananda also asked 2 additional times, but the Buddha continued to respond with the same negative answer. At this point, Ananda asked what turned out to be a crucial question. It's crucial because it highlights the universality of the Buddha's teachings. Ananda simply asked the Buddha, "Can women attain enlightenment?" The Buddha said, "Yes, women can, in fact, attain enlightenment." The story says that Ananda then reminded the Buddha that he owed a great deal to Mahaprajapati. He said, "She was your foster mother. She gave up her life to take care of you." And so in the face of this compelling argument, I think we can imagine, in recognition of Mahaprajapati's display of sotapanna, her powerful aspiration to attain enlightenment, the Buddha finally relented and agreed to allow women into the Sangha. Clearly, Ananda, as the Buddha's cousin, had also heard the Buddha's teaching many times. And so the fact that Ananda did not initially take the Buddha's no for an answer and asked 2 additional times implies that he could not understand the Buddha's refusal. And by the way, scholars have various theories about the Buddha's initial refusal. The most common one is that he may have been aware that outside the walls of the monastery was a patriarchal society. And so he may have been anticipating that admitting women into the Sangha at this time could cause certain societal and cultural issues to arise. But in any case, Ananda finally posed the question, can women attain enlightenment? And whatever the Buddha's reasons were for initially refusing Mahaprajapati's request, when he was asked this question, the Buddha affirmed that women were capable of enlightenment. And at that point, the Buddha agreed to allow women to enter the Sangha. So Ananda, having heard the Buddha's teaching many times, simply asked the most logical question: can women attain enlightenment? Because if the answer is no, women cannot attain enlightenment, then clearly there's inequality, there's separation, and there's a judgmental duality. But Buddhism denies all forms of inequality, all forms of separation, and all forms of duality. But also, Ananda's question is one that we should also ask ourselves whenever we are consciously or unconsciously deciding whether to include or exclude someone based on their gender, their ethnicity, their social status, or any other statistic. As the Buddha himself taught, enlightenment means the actualizing of oneness, and we cannot truly embody oneness unless we also include everyone. And so one way of understanding this is that if we choose to exclude some people, this also ends up excluding us from our own enlightenment. But to me, another factor for the Buddha's decision to include women might have been his being aware of Mahaprajapati's powerful aspiration, her walking 200 miles along with her 500 followers to request permission to ordain. So this was, in fact, an aspiration or desire, that the Buddha's own teachings had created in them, right? And, although her story is often seen as highlighting an early example of women's equality, and I'm not denying that it does, I actually think Mahaprajapati's story ultimately transcends gender and illustrates her having what is arguably the most important quality for any Buddhist. This quality is key because our teachers tell us that without it, we cannot really attain enlightenment. This quality has many names in Buddhism, but the traditional Pali term that I've been using is sotapanna, or stream entry. But there are quite a few other common terms which, admittedly can be confusing. See if you've heard these terms, terms like innermost aspiration, true beginning, shinjin, or a Japanese term, shojoju, which means truly settled. But in my understanding, all these terms are essentially referring to the same kind of attitude. So some teachers might disagree with me, but I think maybe a more down-to-earth word for this quality might simply be enthusiasm. Having an active and energetic enthusiasm for the Dharma means that we are curious and motivated and that we really want to listen to and learn about the Buddha's teachings. I think that, having this kind of enthusiastic attitude has many implications for us, whether we are young people, just starting out and trying to decide on our career, or if we are seniors looking for meaning and purpose in our retirement. This is because we have to find what we really enjoy and what we really love doing, right? But also, our teachers tell us that to be truly satisfying and joy-producing, our activities, our work, must involve, in one way or another, working for the benefit of others. So in fact, a few centuries after the time of the Buddha, the Mahayana movement, which came maybe 3 or 4 centuries afterwards, reframed or reinterpreted enlightenment or awakening to ultimately mean the arising within us of the wish to work for the awakening of others. And so, of course, because Mahaprajapati was responsible for bringing 500 other women along with her to eventually not only ordain, but we're told in the stories, these 500 women, as well as Mahaprajapati, also attained full awakening or full enlightenment. Then Mahaprajapati herself strongly possessed this concern for the benefit of others. And so today, on the occasion of our family Hanamatsuri, I think this is the inspiration that Mahaprajapati's story provides for us. So today, you know, we deeply appreciate not only the Buddha's life and the Buddha's teachings, but also the Sangha, the community of men and women that developed around him. This Sangha, this tradition, developed not only because of the Dharma that the Buddha shared, but also because of his exceptional ability to cause to arise within others an enthusiastic desire to attain the same awakening that he himself experienced. This is what we witness in the story of Mahaprajapati. And so, of course, this strong desire, this sotapanna, is also the Hongan in our temple's name. And so because of the spreading of this crucial desire for awakening from one person to another, we here at Higashi Honganji are, even 2,500 years later, also part of the Buddha's Sangha. So thank you very much for listening, and happy Hanamatsuri. One other thing. If you're interested in reading more about Mahaprajapati, there's a fairly new book published by Wendy Garling called The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, The Extraordinary Life of Mahaprajapati. And so Wendy Garling is a scholar and also a Dharma teacher. And this forward by Dalai Lama. This book has a lot of other information about Mahaprajapati that you might be interested. Not necessarily what I would call a feminist viewpoint exactly, but I would say it's a viewpoint from what we call in academia, a viewpoint from the margins, right? Because as a woman, she's very sensitive to the marginal status that women have experienced throughout their history. So it's a very interesting book that has a lot of interesting factoids, if you will, about Mahaprajapati. So, Garling, rhymes with darling, Garling. Thank you very much.